Good evening, everyone. My name is Kim Dorman, and I serve as the Community Engagement Coordinator for the Princeton Public Library. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's program, which is presented in partnership with the League of Women Voters as part of their annual meeting. We're gathering tonight on Zoom. This session is being recorded, as I noted earlier, and I'll just enable live transcription now. If you have any questions for our panelists at any point during the talk, please put them in the Q&A function at the bottom of, or in the chat, and we will get to them sort of towards the end of the conversation. It's my honor to introduce the most wonderful Ingrid Reed. Ingrid Reed is a policy analyst. I'm always trying to find new ways to talk about my admiration for Ingrid. That's why she's laughing. Ingrid Reed is a policy analyst focusing on New Jersey civic affairs. She directed the New Jersey project at Rutgers Eagleton Institute of Politics from 1996 until her retirement. And she's also one of the founders of a successful startup, NewJerseySpotlight.com. I'll turn it over to Ingrid's capable hands to introduce more about the program. Thank you for joining us.
All right. Thank you, Kim. Thank you for hosting us. And it's a delight to welcome John Mooney to Princeton via Zoom, and really to say congratulations, because that startup has become an important part of New Jersey, and that is NJ Spotlight. And John Mooney, who was an old-fashioned journalist. Is that okay to say that, John?
Yes, quite old-fashioned, yes.
Carrying a pad and making sure that your story appeared in the newspaper the next morning. But he's taken those journalism skills in a bold venture, and I'm going to ask him about that. To NJ Spotlight, which has now brought him and NJ Spotlight to public media. Seriously, John, we agreed that we would take league interests, league areas of study and action sort of as a frame for the conversation with you. And I'd like to start with the league's commitment to bringing information to voters. Or to people in general about the issues and about voting, and ask you to say a little something about the state of media since you were a newspaper journalist and now have gone through a transformation to really public media. Can you tell us a little something about what, when you started out, how many people or how many viewers were following you? What's the nature of the journalism that we now find on our own public media channel, NJPBS, just as to get us to thinking about how important it is to get information out?
Yeah, I mean, I'll even go back a little bit further and cut me off if I'm getting long-winded, but I had joined New Jersey media in the 80s and 90s, really, you know, in large part during what was a heyday for print media in a lot of regards, and including in New Jersey, and spent some years, 10 years at the Star Ledger, you know, during a time that it really saw, you know, as much as it had been an established paper in the state, it really saw a renaissance in terms of quality, and won some Pulitzers and got a lot of national as well as statewide attention. And then everything, you know, fell out from under print journalism, largely driven by, you know, the very different business model that the internet brought. And some were ready for it, some prepared for it, and some didn't. And I will say, you know, I'm pretty comfortable in saying that at least the Star Ledger wasn't ready for it, and kept sort of putting off the inevitable to the point where in 2008, you know, literally the floor fell out from under all kinds of institutions, but the Star Ledger included, and to the point where they offered buyouts and you know, different kinds of severance packages to literally half of their newsroom. And this was happening across the country, where you were seeing, you know, there was some online, and certainly digital was starting to grow, you know, sort of the midway of that decade, but not to the extent anyone thought. And it got to the point where literally half the newsroom chose to leave. It really was, it was a voluntary buyout. I think there was a general consensus. It was a bigger risk to stay than to go. And so the Star Ledger's newsroom went from 300 down to close to 100. And this was happening elsewhere. And you were seeing, really the decimation of print media, at least in newsrooms across the country, and large and small, to the point where with the smallest newsrooms, it was to the point where they, didn't exist anymore.
Right.
And so, when we started up, we wanted to keep, our kinds of journalism, public affairs journalism, alive in a digital format. And that was the beginning of NJ Spotlight in 2010. And with the leadership of Ingrid to really, I will echo the introduction, the most wonderful Ingrid Reed. It was really her enthusiasm that helped guide us and get us on this track. And it really mattered, a big deal. And media changed.
But John, it also meant that you had to work in a different way, not for a corporation. All I did was make it possible for you to be a nonprofit and get support from foundations and members and so on, because you had a different operating
yeah, I mean, it changed.
So,
it changed dramatically. I was a cog in the machine as a reporter in a big, a big organization like the Star Ledger. And suddenly there was, we were an organization of 4 reporters, and not terribly clear lines between fundraising and we had started an event business. It totally changed my view of how journalism was to work. A huge change that lives to this day is, I came from an era where it was incredibly competitive. I worked, my first job was at a morning daily up in North Shore of Boston. We competed with an afternoon daily in the same town, and we'd be waiting for each other to come out. And what stories did we have? We didn't have. I mean, it was intensely competitive. And what has happened in the last 10 years, I think, and I think it's a good thing, is, the media has recognized there's plenty of news for all of us. And, we've found our different niches. We found our different specialties where we're not necessarily competing, where we're actually working together in many ways, and partnerships are coming out of it. And I think it's to the benefit of the general public. I mean, everybody can get every story. I can read, the LA Times and, and the Denver Post, as easily as I can read NJ.com and Asbury Park Press. And so, if we can find our places where we can provide different information, that's of value. And in Spotlight's case, we focus on public policy. We focus on, some of the politics that goes into public policy. And that, I think, we found our place for doing that. And I think it's a value, and we can talk more about it, but us merging with public media and the PBS station here in New Jersey, as well as in New York, even expands that scope even more. Right. And I think it's a really exciting time in that sense.
One of the, I think, the interesting things for the League is that digital makes it possible to have long stories and to keep them there. So I find that in advising people how to find out who's running, it's so much easier to say, go on NJ Spotlight, because they've done the story for every district, and it's always there until the election is over. While if you had done a story in the Star Ledger about who was running on a Sunday, it was very difficult to tell people to go and get their newspaper out of the garbage and read about who the candidates are. So I think there's a real advantage if you are in the business of wanting people to get information.
And it's also a fluid. I mean, as you say, unless you save that special section in print, but even unless you bookmarked an article you liked on a site. I mean, what we recognize with the internet and the opportunities it provides is you can update it. You can, you can do different things with it. You can create discussion groups off of it. I mean, those are all things that were never available to us when we were in print media. And now, and in joining with PBS, now we can bring in videos and one-on-one interviews with the candidates, something that we plan to do with the congressional race,
Mhm.
where we'll have 5 minutes with each candidate if they're
Mhm.
so obliged. We
Mhm.
can't force them to show up, but we hope they
Right.
will.
The
And that's
league
something that
understands that very well. They don't always show up for
they
debate
don't always
either.
show up. That is the problem.
Okay, well, let's switch, John, to one of the things we said we would do, and that is sort of look at New Jersey at midterm, which is sort of funny because we're talking about midterm primary for the federal, for Congress. But it is a fact. We have had an election and things are sort of different. What would you point to that you found out after this primary election, which is always a low turnout, but is there anything that you see that tells us something about New Jersey and what we might be looking at for the next 6 months?
Yeah, I mean, I think it certainly pointed out that it's going to be a tough road for the Democrats. And, by and large, I mean, virtually all the incumbents won, but some were closer than I thought they might be. Certainly, the race, Tom Malinowski against Tom Kaine Jr. is going to be very close.
Mhm. Well,
And
it was before, yeah.
yeah, it was before, and I think there's no question that it will continue to be. In some ways, I was a little surprised that Tom Kaine Jr. did not get a majority.
Mhm.
But primaries are so unique in the dearth of voters. For one, in his case, he also had multiple challengers for the
Right.
Republican nomination.
Mhm.
So even I think he ended up at 46 or 48%, but the other 52% was split among a bunch of candidates.
Right.
The fact that none of those who were really pushing a lot of the agenda that we saw coming out of former President Trump in terms of denying the election and some of the issues around the MAGA movement, none of those seem to reverberate as much as I thought they might.
Right.
I don't necessarily think that's not going to be, or that will be the case in the general election. Again, primaries are so unique. And I think that, so much can happen between now and November. So, on one hand, we didn't see, a big, uprising of folks from the, that end of the Republican Party, but that doesn't mean that they won't show up. I mean, I think I saw a quote the next day from one of the pundits that, no Democrat should feel safe right now going into November. There's just, the indicators that might portend well for them are not going that direction. And you're seeing some of these numbers in terms of the economy. And, I think COVID is still an ongoing issue. Who knows what's going to come out of the court at this point in terms of Roe versus Wade. I mean, there's certainly some indication, that could energize, any side in
Right.
a lot of ways. And then, the gun issues that we're going through, obviously, and school violence. And, I think that those are all, sort of rearing their heads. And, and we're only in June. I mean,
Right.
it's, there's so much can happen between now and then. Not to mention a war over in Europe and some of the issues that are arising over there as well.
And it seems that New Jerseyans are paying attention, even though the primary election is usually low turnout. There seemed to be some energy in all areas about participating, and it also seemed to reflect what happened in the gubernatorial election, that Murphy won, but he didn't win as big as one had thought he would. So there was some energy on the Republican side that had nothing to do with Trump. Would you say that was the case?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about past congressional elections in the years that nobody's paying attention normally.
Mhm.
And I think the stakes have only heightened over the last, 6 years. I mean, really, it came to the fore with President Trump, where Congress really is, matters in the public's eye a lot more than it used to. Whether that will draw people to the, to the vote. I mean, there's certainly there's also so much discussion going on around how we vote and
Right.
early voting and mail-in voting and how we count votes. If for those who followed the gubernatorial election, we weren't counting a bunch of votes, so we didn't even know the winner for a bunch of
Right.
days.
Yeah.
And so these are all issues that, compared to 10, 20 years ago when I was, starting to cover this stuff, or, I was actually older than that. But, these are now prominent issues that never were. Now,
Right.
whether that gets people voting or not we're going to see. I think the Roe versus Wade is going to be a really interesting case, because I think that does mobilize a broad range of folks, and maybe not necessarily in New Jersey, but very well could. I mean, New Jersey is not as predictable as we all know. It's not as predictable as we think it is. I think it's a lot more. There's a lot of different hues of blue and red in this state, and it will impact some of these races. And I think it's going to be fascinating to watch how this works out.
Well, let's talk about another thing that we have not had in New Jersey, in my experience, before we go into looking at the specific issues of things that are going on in New Jersey. We agreed we would take 5 of the issues that the league has been watching for years and playing a role in. But that is right now, what do we do? And it's interesting, we have to ask the question, with all of that money that we have in the state coffers that we never had, and that we always had to struggle to get to a balanced budget. Can you sort of bring us up to date on what that revenue picture or that picture looks like? So, because it's going to affect everything.
Yeah, I mean, we've had a windfall, no doubt, and it's fascinating because I was, covering it, quite closely at the beginning of the pandemic, when there was a panic that we were going to be heading to a cliff immediately. And just the opposite happened. Not only did we not hit a cliff, but we, hit a steep mountain going the other way, in terms of revenue. And it was, both the federal relief fund, the COVID relief, the tax revenues all, saw this huge surge.
Well, don't you think that the tax revenues is really the surprise, while the federal money that piled in, we sort of became accustomed to that as the pandemic continued. But you put those two things together, and it really.
Yeah, and we have literally billions more than we expected, and it is, left a quandary. I mean, a general consensus that these are all one-time hits. We're certainly the federal money, though it was 2 years, it will eventually dry up sooner than later. And then the tax revenues are expected to dry up. And especially when you're seeing what's happening with the market right now, we rely so much on income taxes from people who benefit from the market. And if things are heading the way they are for much longer, I think that's going to be quite a stark reality for the state. And so there is that cliff that we avoided 2 years ago. Now it's out there, and the state has to be, and the governor and the legislature have to be very careful in balancing this, and where they're going to be putting this money. The Republicans are calling for fairly significant tax cuts. Actually, the Democrats are calling for some tax cuts around this.
So that means taking some of that largesse and just doing what we did during the pandemic and shoveling it out the door. But how do you decide who gets what and how much?
Yeah, and that's what's going on right now in these discussions. Part of the challenge is we don't have a terribly great relationship between our governor and the legislature. In fact, it's, it had been very sour, and I thought it would be, mending itself, but there's still 2 different pages on this, and how they come to some agreement on it, I think is going to, that's the test. We are right now in the home stretch on the budget. It must be settled by the end of June. By law, we must have a balanced budget, or we're going to start. I can't imagine we'd go to a situation where we were closing down government when we have this much extra money out there. But, it's an interesting place to cover. And, I don't rule anything out. And it'll be interesting, because we can get into this, but, I think Governor Murphy at this point his aspirations may be beyond New Jersey. And we have a legislature that's sort of trying to get its feet now. It's had some change in leadership, as we all know, with the new Senate president. And, I think that Senator Scutari is going to want to make his mark as well. So, it's sort of an interesting dance that's going on right now.
So if you had to do a little shortcut analysis, what would you say Murphy wants to do with the largesse, or what we're sort of come out? And you said the Republicans are looking for tax cuts or some kind of rebate, or and what do the Democrats want? Do we know?
Well, I mean, they haven't laid out a single plan as yet. I mean, one of the things that Spotlight has paid a lot of attention to over the years, and this is going to be a really interesting year, is all the pet projects that get slid into budgets. And we call them Christmas tree items, and it's basically those holiday gifts that come at the end of the year. We have Christmas tree items in the middle of June and July. But I think that there's certainly going to be, and I think this will happen on both sides of the aisle, there's going to be a lot of efforts to get pet projects into. This is the year. It's a hard time for the administration to say no to anybody when there is so much money. Right. And so it's going to be I think there's going to be a lot of rushing to the spigot to see what they can get out of it. And it'll be a real test of discipline, because I think that you talk to economists, and this is not necessarily the time to just be spending all this money, given the state of our economy. So but Phil Murphy is, as I said, I think he has higher aspirations, and right now he has a piggy bank that can make a lot of friends. So it will be an interesting test for all parties. Right.
And on the other hand, there are people saying this is the time to put some money away, increase the rainy day fund, keep paying into the pension fund, get yourself on solid footing. But there aren't too many people who are making that case and are persuading other people.
Yeah, and think of our needs. I mean, as much as this money's sitting out there, we have enormous infrastructure needs in this state that are only starting to get addressed. We have enormous school construction needs, and we have for 20, 30 years, and we're still, we pumped billions of dollars into school construction, and the needs are still billions more.
That's a good place to switch, John, and talk about some specific issues that you followed and that the league has always paid attention to. What will happen with education, and not just with school construction, but there's always a disagreement about school aid. And didn't we just revise it 2 years ago? Is that getting attention in this period of time?
Yeah. I mean, that is New Jersey will forever be arguing over school funding, and to its credit, because it was really one of the first states in the union to start dealing with some of the equity issues that have arisen in a state like ours. I mean, 4 years ago, I think it's 4 or 5 years ago, Governor Murphy and then Senate President Steve Sweeney entered into a deal of sorts with the legislature going along with them, that they would move, they would follow a formula to getting to what is deemed as adequate funding for every district. And that was a deal. There was a 7-year plan. We're 4 years into it, and it has followed that path by and large, where additional funds, and now it's $1 billion plus, are moving towards getting not just poor districts up to adequate funding, because to be honest, a lot of that happened under previous versions of Abbott versus Burke, our school equity case, but also middle class districts, also some so-called higher income districts that had been getting short shrift in terms of state funding. Now the challenge of it is in trying to right size a majority of districts, it's also reducing funding for a good 100+ districts out there that, at least under the formula, are getting more than their quote unquote share.
Mhm.
Now, that doesn't go over well with a district where they're seeing all this money out there and their money is getting cut from in terms of state aid, and in some cases significant funds.
Has
and
it worked with Jersey City having all that new development getting less?
yeah, I mean, they're losing a lot of funding, but they've also imposed a payroll tax that has brought them, a lot of that development, on the Gold Coast has brought them additional funds.
Right.
And they seem to be somewhat surviving. I mean, they're the ones who are taking some of the biggest hits,
Mhm.
but so is Tom's River and Brick and
Mhm.
a bunch of communities down on the shore.
Mhm.
So, even with all this large S, and it looks like we're moving towards fully funding the formula, there's still fights to be had.
Yeah.
And these
What
fights are
happens? Yeah. What happens with the new efforts like preschool and increased full day kindergarten and so on? Does that come out of the same pot, or?
That's all. Yep. That's part of the funding formula. Yes, the preschool itself is its own fund. So that is sort of moved along its way, separate from the formula itself. But it is all coming out of education funding in general, and so it's not even special ed funding has also increased. We're seeing a lot of costs come out of COVID that, although they're being covered by the federal government right now, once that money goes away, the needs are not going to go away. Especially around special needs, but also mental health funding and some of the remediation programs to help kids sort of catch up from this difficult time.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting to be covering a state that has this ready cash right now, but with the condition that we know it's not going to be there forever.
Right.
And it's put a lot of lawmakers in an interesting spot for sure.
With an economy that doesn't look like it's going to be producing
No.
the salaries that made it possible for people to pay.
And the inflation, the inflation wild card, it's not even a wild card at this point. It's that is as much as some funding has gone up, a lot of it is getting eaten up by the rising costs of fuel and other essential goods.
Mm-hmm. So you must be really having a good time.
Well, I don't think. Just
reporter to see this.
Yeah, I don't think bad news is bad news. But I think certainly for media and covering these issues and bringing some light to fairly complicated issues and also, and we were talking about this earlier, is I think our role in media is not only bringing light to it, but also providing resources for people to find out more information on it. Because we are a statewide site, so we can sort of address issues on a statewide basis. But a lot of these are very local, and how a school spends that money that it has or not.
Yeah.
And how a municipality, fixes its roads and provides for its public safety and the like. Those are really very local debates. And in New Jersey, where we have 600 communities, that's 600 local debates. And it's, it's a true test of democracy when you have all these, what have really heightened debates of late around some of these issues.
Yeah. I know that you have a colleague, John Reitmeyer, that's really now gotten a lot of attention as being the #1 budget watcher. So it must be fun engaging with him and getting his perspectives on it.
He's brilliant. He's as good as anybody on public finance in the state, and we're trying to find different ways to get the information out. That he and Colleen O'Day are one of our reporters who does a lot around data. Have created a budget tool where you make your own budget. And you can pick different different things that you think the funding should go to. Hopefully spurs a little bit of discussion. He did famously a couple years ago, or a few years back now. He had a meter on whether government would close or not due to budget impasse. He hasn't brought that out yet, I didn't want him to jinx the discussions to go, but there's some fun there. And then he's starting to do some stuff more and more on television as well with our partners at PBS.
Yeah,
and part of their business beat segment on their show. So, there's lots of ways to get this information out there, and he's as good as any.
Right. Let's switch to another topic that has changed in what we think fits into the category, and that is environment. And I know Tom Johnson has for a long time been covering that area. But climate change, and which includes things like wind power, is something new for New Jersey. And you have a new podcast that, believe it or not, goes back and looks at Superfund sites from 40 years ago and why they haven't been cleaned up. It's back in the news. What should we know about funding for the environment or policy making for the environment?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned two key areas. I'll give a plug for our podcast. It's called Hazard NJ. We've 2 episodes. It's, you'll see it on our site. It has a pretty big logo of a child playing in a playground, sort of near a symbol of a Superfund site. The program is, I think it's going to be eight episodes in all. And the theme is looking at New Jersey's Superfund sites, some famous, some less famous, and really the impact, not so much on the failure to, well, I guess in part on the failure to resolve them, but also now the climate change challenges, the rising seas, all the different challenges that are coming out of climate change and what they pose for places like Passaic River, which runs through Newark and has been a Superfund site for decades.
So if that overflows, all that stuff goes in people's basements.
And many of them are in neighborhoods that are not necessarily the wealthiest in the state, and so you're dealing with lots of challenges anyway. And then suddenly you have a Superfund site, which by definition is, somewhat been resolved, but it's a matter of finding the funding, federal Superfund funding to finish the job. And, as Ingrid said, some of these are decades old, and time is running out. I mean, it's literally with the factors that are going, that are coming with climate change. They're literally, the window in resolving some of these things is closing. So that's been a big push for us. That's been important to our coverage for a long time. But increasingly, renewable energy has become a focus of our environmental coverage, largely, obviously due to the issues of climate change and some of the perils that we face. And it is, for a long time, it was solar energy in New Jersey. We were the number 2 state in the country in terms of solar energy growth. That has somewhat waned, but we have, more than made up for it in our embrace of offshore wind, where to the point where ourselves and New York and the coastline from New York down to Atlantic City is really going to become, the next, focal point of wind energy in the country. And all that comes with that, including opposition from folks who are afraid their tourism and their views and their waterways are going to be impinged by it, to those who see job opportunities. This is a whole nother industry, especially in South Jersey, that could provide a lot of opportunity. It also brings up issues of land use and what exactly, all these properties are going to be used for. So these are all become, hugely important to the state, and hardly, we're not even getting into the issues of electric vehicles and different technologies that are also popping up. And so, what are the steps that the state is doing to encourage each of these technologies? What are they doing to face some of the backlash on them, or at least some of the criticism? These are constant debates, and even how the energy moves, not just from the windmill, the turbines to the shore, but then how all that energy is going to move across the electric grid and the power grid.
Mhm.
Those are hot debates. So there's no shortage of issues on that as well.
Right. Is there a state subsidy involved? Is it another issue in the budget?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of state money and federal money, for that matter, has gone into these technologies, and it's also gonna be coming out of ratepayers' wallets. I mean, this is there is a cost, and what's been interesting is actually the Murphy administration has been quite reluctant to talk about the costs.
Mhm.
Now, I think it's a valid point that there's a cost in not doing anything.
Mhm.
And embracing these technologies, and that those costs could be far steeper in terms of
Right.
our environment. But there's certainly a cost in doing something. These aren't going up out of nowhere,
Mhm.
and they're not. Our utilities are not paying for these out of the goodness of their hearts. I mean, there is some money to be made out there.
Mhm.
So that's going to be an interesting. So far, we have. The state government has been very supportive of our utilities,
Mhm.
and underwriting them, and allowing ratepayers to underwrite them, and we'll see if that continues. I'm guessing it will. I think
Mhm.
climate is really the issue of our time going forward, and I think that there'll be more support than we think, but it's something we're gonna have to get used to.
Right. And it's hard to identify. It's not the same as school funding, where you can look at a budget and see how much you're getting from the state. Uh, the regulated utilities are not very transparent,
No,
and
not at all.
it's very hard for an individual, unlike a school budget, to be able to figure out if they're getting a good deal or not. And uh, so
And that's a real tangible gain. You see programs happening. Us slowing down climate change is not terribly tangible.
Mhm.
And so there's somewhat of a a need of a trust that in fact these steps are going to make a difference,
Mhm.
because there's plenty of argument that we've sort of passed the tipping point on this.
Mhm.
And so it's going to be an interesting test of the public will. Or are we willing to make these investments when things are probably going to be getting worse before they get better?
Right. You had mentioned voting before, and the league has always been very active in obviously encouraging voting, but also being a watchdog for how voting is run, administered, and so on. And we've never spent money really the way we should on either administration or on equipment. Uh, and given the attention that now seems to be cast on how voting is working, to think that in New Jersey, only I think 3 counties use voting machines that can be audited in the usual way that you would audit, and yet we don't have the state wanting to take a leadership role and the counties wanting to pick their own. What do you see happening there? Should we be spending some of that largesse on just simply getting a new system and maybe some new technology?
Yeah, I mean, you and I talked about this. I mean, our technology is decades old, not just in our voting machines, but
Yeah.
in our state government and our local government as well. And so there's certainly we are well past time for an upgrade. I think I mean our voting system has gone through a lot of changes in the last few years.
Mhm.
To the point where I find it pretty confusing, I'll admit. I'm not sure exactly what my options are. I mean, I think I intended to vote early, and then the early voting stopped, and I was like, wait a minute, so I mean, I follow this stuff, so I have to
Right.
think. I have to think it's confusing to others as well.
Yeah.
I think the intent is to provide more, opportunities for people to vote.
Right.
I don't think we are guilty of some of the fights that we're seeing in other states where there's
Yeah.
real questions of the voters being restricted in access, but we still have some challenges. I mean, we're not getting 100% turnout by any means.
Mhm.
In fact, that early voting turned out to be pretty disappointing with the primary in terms of, it was very few votes. Now, again,
Right.
it's also a primary on a congressional
Yeah, I
election.
mean,
Nobody
may-
votes.
maybe that was not the right decision if you really analyze the
Yeah.
gains that you would get from that against the expense of doing it. Yeah.
And to your point, we have 21 counties who all do it differently. And much like our 600 towns,
Mhm.
they don't give up their power to determine how, things operate in their given county or in their given town.
Mhm.
And as you said, there's only really 3 that allow for the paper ballots that can be audited. Otherwise, it's, you're sort of relying on the technology. And so I hardly think that that's resolved at all. I am somewhat thankful, as a journalist, these things are all interesting to cover, but
Yeah.
I'm thankful we're not going through some of the arguments
Yeah.
that other states are around real
Right.
access.
Right.
But that doesn't mean everybody's voting. And
Yeah.
so I think that there are lots of steps that still need to be taken where people are truly enfranchised.
Right. There are other issues we could talk about, but I think I'd like to give Kim a chance to look at the chat box and see if people have submitted questions to you, John. Kim, are you listening?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm listening fervently with delight. We have 2 questions in the chat, and I just want to remind everyone to please put any questions in the Q&A function or in the chat that you'd like to ask our panelists.
Okay.
One of the questions is, we talk about all this money and the many needs and wishes for that money, including tax holder pockets. Mental health is an enormous issue. Is there any significant legislation put forth on the mental health crisis?
Yeah, I mean, there is I will say, and it's a hopeful sign. There's been more attention to mental health issues in the last year or 2 than I've ever seen. And it's not like we weren't in crisis beforehand in terms of suicide and opioid addiction, but I think COVID really brought things to the fore where it became, undeniable and couldn't be ignored. And I'm really seeing, public money and private money and corporate money to try to address the needs of students and of employees and families. Now, that it is a lot of resources that are required. It's counselors that aren't necessarily out there.
Right.
It's
Unfortunately, yeah.
Yeah, there's tools that aren't necessarily available, especially in a lot of disadvantaged communities and clinics and the like. So yes, there's need that's finally being recognized, and yes, resources being devoted to it, but in a lot of ways the needs are only increasing, and schools especially. I've covered education for a long time, and you're seeing, you're hearing stories about what kids are going through that are just heartbreaking, and schools are trying to address them as best they can. Some are more capable than others, but I listened in on an assembly education hearing last week, and I think 14 out of 15 bills spoke to mental health, and a side issue that's very much comes into it, not a side issue because it's enormous in its own right, but these school shootings, and some of the measures to be taken on trying to get to these kids, long before that they're at such a state where they feel they have to resolve this with the violence that we've seen. And so, I did a story last week on threat assessments in schools, which I never thought I would write those words.
Yeah.
But there are screening tactics, for those kids who are really that disillusioned. And it's not just about, preventing school shootings, but it's also preventing them from hurting themselves. I mean, the violence goes both ways. So there's a lot of attention to it, but there's also a lot of questions of capacity and resources that aren't resolved yet.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. We have conversations in the library about how to just get people to okay.
Yeah,
because they're having
exactly.
so much suffering. Yeah. Thank you. Jan Narayan says, please discuss how likely it is that the New Jersey Attorney General will be able to operate without interference from the governor and others. I am concerned that the Sheridan murder investigation will get buried.
Yeah, I mean, that, that's an interesting one. I don't know if you all have followed the podcast being done out of WNYC on that case. Nancy Solomon has done, I think, a great job. It's really fascinating the way she tells the story. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure how independent. I mean, your point, without any interference from the governor. I think that under the rules that they are separate, but I think there's going to be some politics on whether that gets reopened or not. I have not followed it, the latest developments closely, other than that they are looking at it again. But I'm curious how that will fare. I mean, that is such a bizarre case, and I was just talking with somebody today about it, and I think it'll be very interesting. I do wonder on a case like that has already taken so long to drag out, it probably behooves a lot of the players that it just continues to drag. And I sort of have that sense, but I'll admit I have not followed, as a reporter, I've mostly been reading other people's coverage of it. And I'm not sure we're going to have a big breakthrough on that, but we very well may.
Thanks, John. This seems like a very league question. Louise Haberman says, how do we get incumbents to participate in candidate debates?
Yeah, good luck with that. I mean, for us, it's true too. I mean, one of the beauties, this is somewhat of an aside, but one of the beauties of us joining up with PBS, NJPBS in New York, is they still love the TV camera. And I don't know if it's a ego thing or a vanity, but turning on a camera seems to at least draw people to us as news providers in ways that just the printed word don't. So I don't, I'm not saying that you all should be getting into the TV business, but it has worked for us. And one of the things we're going to be doing at Spotlight and in cahoots with our broadcast is we're going to have these individual interviews with each candidate, again, if they show up. Now, one of the beauties of also what we've been doing for the last 2 years with Zoom calls and remote is, their excuses. They don't need to come to a studio or to a library anymore. All they have to do is turn on the camera. So, some of those barriers at least have been knocked down. Now, whether, people will admit to it or not, we'll see. I also wanted to add quickly on the mental health issue is it has gotten such, so much attention elsewhere, but NJ Spotlight, we just hired literally in the last 2 weeks, a reporter who's going to be covering specifically mental health issues in the state. And that's a first for us. And I think really for any news outlet in the state, we're really devoting those resources specifically to that, those issues, and not just issues coming out of COVID, but again, suicide and opioid addiction and a lot of the issues that stem out of that. And so that really, and that beat was created because we had some support and some funding support. So, people are paying attention out there in ways they haven't before.
That's really exciting, John. Thank you.
John, you mentioned that there aren't staff people, or all different kinds of medical assistants and so on. Is there a money and a program to say have community colleges at least start the process of what is it that you need to know if you really want to be in that field? What do you do about creating enough people to meet a need?
Yeah, I mean, and it's not even, it's not just mental health either. I mean, schools are in general, educators and counselors. There's there's both a rising number of people, and not as much as some would claim, but there certainly is an uptick in people getting out of the field after the last 2 years. I mean, because it's been so difficult. It's mostly people saying that they'll get out of the field sooner than they had planned to, as opposed to getting out right away. But the biggest problem is the pipeline behind, in colleges, in community colleges, in high schools, for that matter, of folks who want to get into these fields of helping, whether it's in schools or in counseling or nursing. There's a lot, and so and there have been some programs that I think are encouraging, but they take forever, where they're trying to instill some of these, these passions in students, in elementary school, and, trying to sort of build the pipeline from the bottom. But, those kids are 10, 15 years out. So, we went through a very tough time with school-based programs under Governor Christie, where there was a lot of contentious, debate and fighting with public employees, and it really became a bit of a blood sport. And I think that did turn off a lot of people. And I'm not putting this all on Governor Christie. I just think it was the mood of the time. But it turned off a lot of people to these public service fields.
Oh, sorry.
That's not me.
I muted just in case there was something private. So you have to unmute if you want to talk. I'm jealous of how many phone calls you get. No one calls me anymore.
Well, I'm really old fashioned. I don't even know how to turn off my phone. That is a phone that you put up to your ear. So I think we need some kind of special program for getting seniors up to date on technology.
I'll let my colleague.
No, seriously, I do think that more and more of government services, of everything, is relying on people using technology, and I'm not sure we're doing a good job. It's sort of like AARP doing driver education. I think we should have a special technology education course for
one of the things that may be a positive sign, but I think it's taking longer to take hold than we had thought, was telemedicine and and some of the remote instruction. I mean, it was a bit of a nightmare, in the last couple of years, but it also, I think, opened our eyes to what is possible if done well. And I think telemedicine probably has more, more promise in a lot of ways than that does, teleschool or remote instruction. And telemedicine with healthcare, with mental health, I think is, from what I've read about it and talked to our reporters, it's a tougher road to climb, mental health than is primary health. It requires a certain one-on-one trust that you don't necessarily have, with a computer between you.
Right.
But I think it also, it's providing something for folks who are feeling desperately lonely or in despair or really facing very difficult times. And if these computers we're all staring at provide another lifeline, I think, that's well worth it. And I think that will happen in time. We all thought it would happen immediately, and we'd all sort of become these mobile entities that can talk to each other at all times and will. And I think we're first going to try to get back to some normalcy that we had before the pandemic. Right. And then I think some of the lessons from the pandemic may start seeping into our behaviors.
Right. We don't have too much time left, and there are still some issues that, and I thought maybe you'd want to pick some. One is justice issues. We've seen some change, for example, in how to handle juveniles who are incarcerated. And finally, the governor, I think, saw the light. We're still not doing well in terms of what we do with people who are released from prison and need jobs, except for sort of former Governor McGreevey. There seems to be a real need to, how do you integrate people back into society. Housing is another topic. Prescription drug prices. It just goes on. So
immigration.
Which one would you like to say? How about cannabis?
Yeah, I mean that. Speaking of criminal justice, I think as much as we've made gains, our juvenile justice numbers are still especially the disparities, racial disparities are still scary. You know, and the fact that we were, you know, putting juveniles in isolation for as long as we were, even before, you know, addressing that. The Edna Mahan, what happened at that prison.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying
The women's prison. Yeah.
Yeah, the women's prison, and basically how the administration pretty much looked the other way until you know, watchdogs and the press brought some attention to it. And you know, I guess we all recognize prisons aren't you know, necessarily certainly are not country clubs, but what was happening there and the kinds of abuses we knew about, I do find scandalous. And I think that was, you know, it's not just Murphy. I think there were governors before him and corrections directors before him, but you know, those kinds of issues. And now, but does that get people riled up in the, you know, in the voting booths? You know, I don't think prisoner rights are one of those issues that get a lot of sympathy from voters. But I also think that, you know, as a society, you know, we are somewhat judged on how we treat those with the least privilege. And certainly our prisoners are among them. And so, you know, some of the things I think the state has done, it doesn't speak well of our state by any means. So, you know, those issues I think certainly continue. That has shown itself in how we had the ICE detention centers and how we've treated immigrants. You know, I think a lot of these, you know, we still, as wealthy and accomplished as the state is, we still have some incredible disparities.
Including affordable housing is another issue.
Housing, yeah, in schools, in healthcare, maternal health is, you know, I mean, the fact that women, you know, are dying having babies is striking in this day and age. And so there's certainly, you know, given all that we've talked about with resources and the like, there's a lot of work still to do, and probably and surely far more than we have the resources. So it is about setting some of the priorities to the things we find most important.
Right. So we have to watch who's there running it and make sure that we join the League of Women Voters to alert people to be good voters and see what our values are and vote with that in mind. How's that for a conclusion? And to thank the League for inviting you. John said that we could invite you to address a larger group of people in our region. And I'm sure that if they hadn't heard of it, NJ Spotlight might be a good place for people to know that they can get more information and longer stories if you really want to find out what's going on. So
yeah, and I will anybody who has questions or story tips or the like. I think I just I don't know if I said I put our I don't know if I put it in the right place, my email address. If not, I think I put it in the chat, and maybe
I can put it in. I'll put it in for everyone.
And that's just my email, and I love to hear from folks. So if you have questions or comments on coverage or things that you think should be covered, email me anytime, and I promise you I will get back to you. It may take longer than it should, but I love hearing from folks. So please feel free to reach out anytime.
Well, thank you, John, for taking time to talk with us and really sharing both your concern and your passion for good journalism that can stand the test of being examined and challenged. It's really great to have you with us for a whole hour, and I want to thank the League for thinking that you would make a good speaker for their annual meeting. You really did.
Well, and thank you for all you do, Ingrid. You really make a huge difference out there. So
well, that's because I was a League of Women Voters member for a very long time.
So,
all right, we'll say good night. Thank you, Kim, and thank you, John, again.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful evening.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.